As I remember, I've always been interested in biology. And this is actually my first biological memory is the blue whale skeleton. And I think I was about 3 when I saw that. It's not an insect, but it's biological. But actually, before I have a memory, so this is me when I'm 2, and my mum and dad, my mum has a botany degree and my dad's a plant pathologist, they probably thought I was interested in plant material, but actually there's a butterfly there. So very early entomological interest. I did get to entomology properly at the end, and I went off to UEA to do a PhD with Tony Dixon, who unfortunately can't be with us today. And I was extremely privileged to come into a group where there were a group of 13 entomologists working on all aspects of cereal ecosystems, looking at the pest management. And I was really interested in this because as an undergraduate, a guy called Noel Gibson, who's sadly deceased, introduced us to the concept of what in those days was called integrated pest control. And I put this quote up here from Benjamin Walsh, who was an English entomologist, who was the first entomologist for the state of Illinois in the 1860s. And I think this is really perhaps the first mention of proper pest management. So he's talking about how people just like painted powders, the easy solution, something you can throw on the ground or rub on your face to make you younger, a pill to take so that you're not fat, rather than actually thinking, what sort of programmed exercise can we do? How can we do things sensibly? And he puts it here. Look, think about something simple, common sense, based on science. And they'll laugh at you because they think the easy option is what it takes. And this is sort of, I remember going back to see Uncle James, who had a farm in Green Hamilton, and telling him all about his integrated pest control. It was really exciting. And he said, I've got a tank mix. I don't need to do IPC. He laughed at me. And we still have this problem. There's lots of people out there who are still conservative with a small c. They're not that keen on something that is a bit slower, doesn't have immediate results. So what I was interested in was doing things to do with pest management. How can we make our crops, whatever they are, more profitable and give us better yields without putting too much money into controlling the things that are going to compete with us. And if you want people to use pest management, you've got to be able to come up with ways that make it less likely that they will use prophylactic spray. So you need to come up with monitoring and forecasting systems that you can predict, will you need to spray, rather than just spraying for the sake of it. So to do that, you need a forecasting system. And it's not just a matter of gazing into a crystal ball. You've got to have something that gives plenty of warning. Growers have got to have time to plan, to know what they're going to do. It's got to be user-friendly. It can't be super complicated. That involves a farmer getting down on his hands and knees and counting every 10th plant and seeing how many aphids there are and then coming out 5 days later and doing it again. It's got to be something that's easy and accessible. It's got to be cost-effective. Nobody's going to use a system that's going to cost too much. And it's got to be reliable. If you've got a forecasting system, if it doesn't work, they won't use it. One failure, growers will say it doesn't work. Again, that small c for conservatism. You've got to get it right. So you'd have thought I'm now an agricultural entomologist, but no. I come back to the UK and I find myself working for the Forestry Commission, where I learned how to climb trees and use pole pruners. But actually what I was doing was coming up with pest management solutions for major forest pests. And the one I spent a lot of my time on was the pine beauty moth, which was attacking the large plantations that the Forestry Commission had planted in the 1950s of alien conifer species. So this is lodgepole pine. And during the late 1970s, early 1980s, Scotland, the north of Scotland, was attacked by pine beauty moth. So this is a native insect who suddenly decided, we don't like lodgepole, well, we like lodgepole pine, we're going to eat it. And it killed hundreds of hectares of pine plantation. So the Forestry Commission, of course, wasn't very happy about this, and they wanted to know, A, why was this moth attacking lodgepole pine, and B, how could we reduce its pestiferousness. We thought I'd be too busy to do anything else, But I was actually really interested in island biogeography. So I was heavily influenced by these guys, MacArthur, Ant-Man Wilson and Dan Simbolov, and their theories in island biogeography. And because I liked bird cherry and rosaceous trees, I did lots of sort of work in my spare time looking at species-area relationships of bird cherries and rose bushes and things like that. And you think, well, how does that apply to sort of real life? It's just ecological theory. But actually, in later life, we were able to think about island biogeography in terms of how do we make our urban environments more attractive? How do we plant better native species on roundabouts, for example? We get more birds, we get more native insects. So this is work that Alvin Heldon at Anglia Ruskin now did, and Lizzie Jones, who's at NERC, and again couldn't be here. So that sort of developed from that early interest in very theoretical species-area relationships. We get a nice practical outcome. What was I doing when I arrived at Silwood? Well, the first thing that was happening in the early 1990s was people were really interested in climate change. And that's where I first started a very long collaboration with Richard Harrington, who again isn't here, at Rothamsted. And we've continued to collaborate today, albeit not on climate change very much. Also where I first started to get into glasshouse work, so looking at biological control of beasties in glasshouses, which still goes on today. But really importantly, I started this collaboration with Dennis Wright, where we were looking at how you can manipulate crops, pests and natural enemies for better pest management. And this was our first sort of big project together, which gave me a chance to go to Kenya, for example. This was on cabbages. Also, of course, those of you who are around will remember this was the early 90s were when biofuels and biomass sort of became really interesting. And there was lots of money out there. And I found myself working with Keith Walters, who's in the audience, looking at, is miscanthus going to be a host plant, act as an overwintering host plant for the bird cherry aphid and the barley yellow dwarf virus? The good news is it won't. Bird cherry aphid does not like miscanthus. And interestingly enough, I now have a student working on miscanthus, but looking at it from the bird's point of view. What are we doing now? So we're training more entomologists and pest managers. The courses are up and running, they're advertised, we've got students on the course now, and recruitment for next year is looking incredibly high, higher than it's ever been before actually. Where are we going next? Well, we're going to do more of the same, but more detail, and we're going to get down into the soil. The soil's really important. Of course, we've now got a new soil and water management centre here at Harper, so we hope to be interacting with Shane in that respect. And we've got Fran, who's here, who's working on the Colembla and looking at agricultural practice on Colembla diversity, and Katie, who's just started last week, who's also here, who's looking at oak jewel beetle and its possible role in acute oak decline. We're increasing our collaboration with forest research, got new projects starting with the Game Conservancy, another new project starting with a biocontrol company, and more discussions underway, and we're also talking to a couple of agrochemical companies about future projects. So it's sort of looking very exciting for the future.